Um, so Isabel, so I've just pressed the record button, so we're recording now, and I guess I just wanted to say thanks so much for speaking to us, and just to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just to introduce yourself and perhaps say a bit about where you work.
Okay. Yeah, thanks again for contacting me and for this interview. So I'm Isabel Unanue. I am a clinical psychologist based in Puerto Rico. I graduated about 4 months ago from my doctorate, and my dissertation research was on Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria. And that's what really led me into the field of community psychology and the climate crisis. It wasn't really my area of research before. And now I'm in Puerto Rico, frankly, taking a little breather and seeing where to take the work next.
Mm. Mm. So you're in Puerto Rico, and you were looking at the impact of the hurricane. Was that right?
Yeah, so, it was really a very shocking event. And my family is based here, and I was in California at that point. And so I wanted to do something to contribute to Puerto Rico while away. And really, what struck my attention was more than, of course, the devastation, but what I was seeing, especially in the immediate aftermath, was a lot of news of people organizing together, like residents from different communities coming together and proposing new ideas that I hadn't historically seen in Puerto Rico. So, for example, people were really talking, like the conversation around agroecology was much more salient, and also about community collaboration. There were a bunch of mutual aid centers, over 10 mutual aid centers that sprung around the island because more rural communities with lower resources weren't getting sufficient government support. Mm-hmm. So they had to take matters into their own hands. So I was curious about that phenomena, and I wanted to research it from a psychological perspective to give language to what was happening.
Okay. Wow. So where did that take you then? What did you find yourself doing as part of that work?
So ultimately, I settled on a grounded theory approach. It was the one that, that method most stood out for me. There's a qualitative research method wherein you go in, you're meant to go in blank slate, try to read as little as possible before going to conduct interviews. And based on the data that you get from your interviewees, you build theory, and you're choosing your sample. And I'll be frank, that's probably one of the biggest limitations of the study. I was a doctorate student, and I conducted all the interviews by myself. Then, to make it more rigorous, I had coders who went into the data without knowing, and they're both Puerto Rican Spanish-speaking women, graduate students as well. So the summer of 2018, I came to Puerto Rico, and I conducted 69 interviews in over 10 communities around the island. And all of these, really, what brought them together was that they were very, very highly impacted. Over 50% of my sample didn't have electricity for at least 6 months, and over 80% reported significant neighborhood damage. Mm-hmm. But what was amazing was that in most of the communities I went to, residents unanimously reported coming together in the aftermath of the hurricane to help one another out. Mm-hmm. And of course, I tried to choose communities, some of the communities, following grounded theory, you're trying to choose communities that have ways that they contrast with one another. Mm-hmm. So I tried to find some where there was really remarkable efforts, but then others where I felt it had already kind of gone back to baseline. Others where it was run by an NGO that might have sprung placed itself there afterwards, and others where it was more grassroots. And in this manner, I gathered my sample until I felt I had enough information to start analyzing the data.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of interviews, Yeah.
It was a lot of interviews. Yeah. I mean, the person I feel most thankful for was the person who transcribed them, because
Right.
that was really onerous work. That was not me.
Okay. Okay. And and the interviews were they in Spanish?
Yes, all of them were in Spanish, except one male who was a US veteran based in a rural community here in Puerto Rico.
Okay. Okay. And does that make, I mean, I'm just thinking here about, say, how we make sense of the world around us. Does it make a difference, the language that people speak in, when they start to describe their experiences? Are there particular words or concepts that I don't know, are formative in any way? Or
I mean, I feel that as a Spanish speaker and as someone who's, the transcribers were also Puerto Rican. The transcriber was Puerto Rican, and then the coders were Puerto Rican. And I feel like because of that, I'm sorry, the transcriber is Cuban, lives in Puerto Rico, he's Cuban. But anyway, I feel like you can gather the nuance of their frustration, of the local dialect that they use. I mean, there's nothing here that's like, really standing out for me right now in terms of, I mean, obviously, if I would have done the interviews in English, I don't think I would have captured the same sentiment, or would they have had the same trust. In Puerto Rico, there's a history of research studies where people felt that they were being exploited. The worst case, for example, was when they tested birth control on women here, and many women became infertile as a result.
wow.
So there's a little bit of fear of being guinea pigs for studies. So these interviews felt very open-ended. I think they even kind of bordered on therapy, in the sense that it was providing a space for people to speak openly about their experience. And I think the fact that it was in Spanish and that I could attune with the local culture made it much easier. I went into these communities, and sometimes they were like, "Oh, you want some coffee?" I'm like, "Sure." It just felt much more familial.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Like you say, I mean, I'm asking a question there about language and concepts, and the kind of issues that you're highlighting are much more about, say, issues of power and trust, and people feeling, whether it's been almost an extractive process before, around research, and whether this was maybe conducting it in Spanish feels a much more collaborative venture for people, especially with you being a Puerto Rican native yourself, Yeah. Wow. Okay. And what was the experience of this like for you when you were doing this work? What effect did it have on you?
I mean, it was amazing to conduct the interviews and see really the level of poverty there is in Puerto Rico. I think a lot of people, I was born in San Juan, brought up in San Juan. I think you can be very checked out of the reality of Puerto Rico. And that's sort of what the government, supports in a way. You kind of can live in your own little bubble. So there's just like a lot of suffering. And I was just kind of moved by how many people really needed still. I mean, I did the interviews a year after Maria, just how many people needed mental health support who could not find it, and how the coming together of the community served as its sort of, psychosocial support. And so I argue that in the paper and in the dissertation, that in a way, without maybe consciously intending to, the activists and the community leaders who helped bring people together really were providing some form of therapy. So it was very humbling, and I think it showed the importance of having to decentralize this sort of work, and how there should be different points around the island where there's some sort of where there's more literacy around emotional intelligence and trauma and all of these issues that really struck home to people. And not to say, of course, resources, right? Because mental health knowledge is very important, but you really need your basic needs met to be able to engage in that sort of work. So it was very humbling, and I feel, but at the same time inspiring. People are amazing everywhere, and there were just so many remarkable people who were giving without any compensation. And so that's what I talk a lot about in the paper, about post-traumatic growth and how it happens in the advent of a disaster. I don't know if you are familiar with collective post-traumatic growth.
I've never heard that term before, no. So like, I've heard of post-traumatic growth, but I don't really know very much about it. But collective post-traumatic growth, I've never heard of before at all. That'd be really interesting to hear a bit about that.
Okay, well, so maybe I can share a slide with you
Sure.
to kind of go through what I found. I'm just trying to make the screen bigger. Maybe I'm not that technologically savvy sometimes either. Here we go. And I'd love to make it full screen, but
yeah, sometimes it just won't happen on. Oh, there you go. Nice.
Okay. So basically, this is the model of what I found, or this was the way I was most able to represent the results. So you have the traumatic climactic event. As a result of that, especially in communities where there's no access to resources, there's this emergent community collaboration. And this was really everywhere. Even the places where the community was like, well, we're no longer doing these meetings and stuff, there was still community collaboration in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane and the weeks following. And in some cases, this community collaboration led to larger transformative process, whereas in others, things went back to baseline, to what I call in the paper, just, the status quo. And so to describe what was happening, I've used the term post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth, you're right, for the most part, it's been seen as an individual level concept, but there's more and more emergent research, some of it actually coming mostly from Europe, on collective post-traumatic growth. And it's really interesting because if we talk about, post-traumatic growth, let me look up a slide here, right? Right, these are the dimensions at which post-traumatic growth happens. So just to highlight, right, post-traumatic growth are the positive changes that occur as a result of the struggles with highly challenging life circumstances. And the research that has been done on this, mostly by Tedeschi and Calhoun, is that you grow an enhanced appreciation for life, more meaningful interpersonal relations, a heightened sense of your own personal strength, a change in priorities, and a richer spiritual life. However, when it's collective, you start going into ideas of justice and fairness. So the new research that's coming out is speaking to this, how, in the aftermath, people, by being kinder, by collaborating more, by having more enhanced appreciation for life, tend to exemplify fairer systems of governance. And so I think that's fascinating. And one of the things I most like of the theory of post-traumatic growth is this idea of a shattering of assumptions. And so the way they describe it is that basically we have all our worldviews, right? And then a hurricane comes and it takes your house down, and you just realize that the world is not as predictable as you once thought. So that shatters your assumptions, it shatters your worldviews. And it's kind of comparable to the physical rebuilding that occurs after an earthquake, in the sense that from that shattering of assumptions, you have to cognitively process and restructure your worldviews. And what usually tends to stick are new assumptions, that the ones that withstood the shaking and what has not. And so I think that there was new assumptions that were gathered on, people didn't have any access to government support. The government was very slow to come to, especially these communities with lower resources. So people had to take matters into their own hands. And what I think surprised them in the process was, one, oh my God, my neighbors are helping me. And you know, people kind of got over whatever sort of issues they had beforehand and came together as hurricane survivors. And the phenomenon I most saw in terms of leadership, so many leaders came from their own community, like people who really just took the reins. Like everybody was maybe collaborating, but some people really had a vision. And often that vision went beyond just reconstruction, especially, for example, with the mutual aid centers. Those mutual aid centers that were originally created as distribution centers, some of them then became agriculture initiatives, cultural community centers that still remain to this day. Mm-hmm. And the leaders for those were often people who were university level trained, who sometimes moved from San Juan to rural communities. And you saw this in a lot of communities. And so people were then, you know, oh my God, we can do this. You know, we didn't even know that we could do this. And one of the things I mentioned in the paper is that post-traumatic growth arises because you are creating new assumptions about the world, also in an effort to avoid future trauma. So let's say you've lost someone who's dear to you, and now you're like, well, now I really want to appreciate people more because I just lost someone who's really important to me. Well, in this case, another thing that you want to, one of the other assumptions you're reaching is like, I can do this myself. I can work with my community. We can make things happen. There was also a sense of like, wow, that there's not necessarily justice being served. We have to create more just forms of governance. So these are sort of the new things that are arising. Now, I wish I can just tell you this really positive story, like, oh, you know, and after the hurricane, everyone saw the light, but that's not necessarily the case. And so what I then speak about is that things tend to often go back to the status quo. And the reason for this, the reasons I identified are, for example, one, on the right in red are the reasons, the barriers to transformation. And I want to talk a little bit more about what transformation is and why I think it's important. And on the left are the facilitators to transformation. So some barriers are, you know, pretty simple. The return of amenities. The moment you get your light back, you get your TV back, people tend to kind of go back and become siloed. And this has been found not only in Puerto Rico, but in other places after disasters. After the amenities come back, the community collaboration often tends to dissipate. And also people have to get back to work, you know, people have to go back to work.
Did you use the word siloed there, Isabel? Yeah. So just checking I'd understood that correctly. So the idea that you kind of go back into a more like atomized individual kind of mode. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Lack of government support. You know, if these initiatives aren't supported by the government or financially, people, you know, it often dies out. We live in a society that you need to go to work, you need to make money, and a lot of the mutual aid centers are volunteer based. All of them are volunteer based, although I know some of them since then have looked up 501c3 NGO status to be able to ask for donations and continue their efforts. Leaders burn out. So that's another reason there's a barrier, and interpersonal conflict. So maybe in the aftermath of the hurricane, you're like, oh, we're all hurricane survivors, we come together. But often then it's like, I have issues with this. And what you realize is there's a lot of trauma that precedes the hurricane. There's trauma that has to do with, you know, having limited resources, limited education. And there's often not the emotional literacy to be able to kind of keep that collaborative framework. And I mean, it might sound trite, but there was a lot of gossip that would resurface and all these interpersonal tensions and I don't really like that person. And whereas all of that was sort of forgotten in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
Now things that, yeah.
I was just going to say as well, this is really interesting. And it echoes some of the work that was carried out, and along with a lady, another psychologist called Sally Zlotowitz, I co-chaired the British Psychological Society's Community Action and Resilience work stream following the pandemic, which is, again, it's not climate change, it's a different issue, isn't it? It's a different kind of crisis that affected everybody, but obviously affected some people more than others, in the same way that climate crisis affects some people more than others. But some of the things you're describing in here are very, very salient. One piece of work that was carried out by that group was looking at how to support groups into the longer term. And it was interesting because one of the things it recommended was that, that groups have an identity, and that government, local and central government initiatives engage with those people and regard them as kind of allies and collaborators in providing this kind of support. And there's a recognition that, as you've just described, once people have to go back to work, there's a real drain on the resources of those organizations. And there isn't always a lot of capacity at the center, and often they rely on a couple of local inspirational leaders who carry a lot of the burden, but who themselves are human beings and can't necessarily keep delivering this. And quite often, sometimes those people have been victims of trauma themselves in the past, and that might be part of their motivation for seeing, for trying to promote something, but that makes them vulnerable, to exactly what you've just described here, leader burnout. But it's really interesting seeing this slide, and seeing this framed differently around, the idea of transformation, of community transformation, and thinking about what some of the kind of the drivers or the ingredients might be towards and away from this transformation process. So yes, it's a really interesting slide.
Yeah.
Mm.
So in terms of the facilitators, I felt I put here critical consciousness, people's awareness of injustice and acquiring a language for it, which was sometimes learned just through the experience, other times by these leaders, these university trained leaders who were coming to these different communities, or whoever the leader was, often had, a more critical perspective. Giving that language, it's a little bit like social justice informed psychotherapy. My training is mostly in psychotherapy because I'm a clinical psychologist, but working at the community level. And with all the patients I've worked with, many of them, for example, immigrants in the United States, being able to speak or to be validated in that you're seeing injustice is deeply healing and deeply liberating. So the critical consciousness that people created, and that's by Freire, on being able to, it comes from liberation psychology and pedagogy of the oppressed in Latin America, but the ability for us to critically examine our systems is in itself a healing mechanism. So I think critical consciousness was key, and that sort of falls out of post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth historically has looked at the dimensions I mentioned, but not necessarily at the acquisition of critical consciousness. And I think critical consciousness here also falls within this post-traumatic growth.
Okay, that's interesting. So this is work that I guess people from a European tradition or from a UK tradition in psychology may have heard of, people like something like Paulo Freire, maybe less perhaps Ignacio Martin Barrow, but kind of may have heard terms like liberation psychology but not know a huge amount about it. But what you're suggesting is that critical consciousness is a really important element of this post-traumatic growth, that you see in the social justice psychotherapy, but also in this kind of community response to the disaster, like a hurricane, and the way that people make sense of what's happened during that time. Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Then sense of community, like people coming together, that's also a facilitator in and of itself. Feeling as a part of a community gives you fuel to keep going. And compassionate leadership. I mean, I really think that and post-traumatic growth speaks to that, about the more empathy, after a trauma, and that compassion can be very moving to
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
When people were like, "Oh my God, like people here are literally here to in solidarity, not out of pity, not just to come get votes," which they often talked about that, like, oh, the government just shows face when they're here to get votes. To see this authentic interest in them
Mhm.
was really revelatory and moving. And so I also find that there's, a lot of need for compassionate leadership. And actually, an activist that um, I know, she is hoping and intending to create a compassionate leadership training for communities. And I think that sort of work, part of my training is also in the mindfulness compassion fields. So I think it's really exciting to think about these methodologies we're creating to augment
Mhm.
compassion, to learn how to be compassionate and more empathic.
Mhm. Wow. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people, when they hear about words like empathy or mindfulness, don't necessarily think then of critical consciousness and social change. Do you know? Yeah, those things don't often sit side by side, do they? In my head. Um,
But there's more stuff coming out. There's beautiful research coming out on this.
mhm.
That for example, Rhonda McGee, an educator, she wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, and that book is about how we can use compassion practices to embody racial justice. And there's more research. I would actually say that's sort of the new wave in the mindfulness compassion community, because there's a lot of critique on how it's not very diverse,
Mhm.
and it can even often serve as a way to escape societal issues.
Yeah.
That's not the purpose, though.
Mhm.
That's not its original intention. So I think there's more and more, and I'm very interested in working in that intersection.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, it sounds like it's been a really fertile kind of intersection already. Do you know, just the way those ideas have worked together in this particular piece of research? That's
Yeah.
been really interesting. That's been really interesting. I mean, do you have a sense of what happens next with this work? Where you want to take it next?
Yeah, so I know you mentioned, about concepts that are important or became important in this study. One is the concept from community psych by Krylotensky of transformation.
Mm.
Transformation is right when you're really trying to address the root cause of the issue, not so much just first order change, like what you see often in mental health, where it's like, oh, just take a pill or just think more positively, when you're not really talking about like the societal injustices that are happening that are leading to the issue in the first place. So I felt like at a micro level, this was emblematic of transformation. Although after kind of reading more and talking to other scholars in this area, they're like, you can't really call it transformation because it's not transformation till it's systems wide.
Mm.
And so that's a really interesting debate,
Mm.
because then there's this other term I really love, prefigurative politics, which is when you start embodying the change that you want to see in the world, even if it's at a micro level.
Mm.
And I think that's where I want to take my work next,
Mm.
sort of into the prefigurative realm, and maybe, just working with one community and going deep into how do we create a system where like people's needs are placed first, and where we try to exercise compassion at the leadership level, but also at the communal level. Like, what would that look like? I don't want to be crazy idealist here, but I do think that these practices can be very transformative. And I think there's a big place for smallness and the importance of smallness to kind of show what is possible. Because I think once we get sort of lost in scaling, we might even get decentered, and I think it's really, and there's more research on that now, on how, for example, if the therapist is more mindful, that leads to better outcomes in therapy. So how important it is for us to embody the change that we want, that we want to see in the world. I mean, truly, like right now in Puerto Rico, I'm literally just trying to become a more eco-conscious
Mhm.
like person.
Mhm.
Everything here is privatized. Compost is privatized. Getting food from the organic market is more difficult. I used to live in California. Everything was more accessible. So I'm just trying to slow down and find out, okay, so how do we do that
Mm.
here? And just trying to be as thorough as possible in that. And yeah, so I think that would be the next step. And I've kept many of those relations with the people I interviewed, and some more than others, of course. And, the other day I was with one of the activists who created a mutual aid center, and he's like, hey, we want to create a psychology program here for the community. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. So how do we, because it's kind of sad, right? That, and this was found in research in other places, in geography, I think also some work in social psychology, that right in the aftermath you see this change, but then after a while you go back to the status quo, because the system often wants to keep the status quo. That's where the profit is. And so my question is then, well, okay, so if that wants to be kept, but how do we keep this going? How do we keep this small transformation going? How do we make it more sustainable? So that's where I see my research going in the future. And yeah, but nothing that has started yet.
No, but well, that's fascinating. That is fascinating, Isabel. And I can understand the root. It's almost like grounded theory as an approach has taken you to a point where it's kind of changed some of the way you look at something like this, something like a significant crisis and its impact on people. And then I guess the invitation from some former.
You're kind of frozen. Okay, here you're
Oh,
back.
sorry. I was just saying, yeah, it's interesting, like the grounded theory research has taken you to a certain point, and now it seems like you're moving into a different relationship with the participants in the research. And I think, as we probably said just before the interview, it almost sounds like they're becoming more like collaborators or informants to the next phase of your work, which again is an interesting shift, isn't it, in our relationship with people.
Yeah. Another author I love a lot is Adrienne Marie Brown, who speaks of this idea of emergent strategy. So how strategy for whatever comes next or whatever we want to do emerges out of relationality, out of the relationships we build, and kind of putting that at the center, authentic connection and relationship, and going from there. So I'm hoping, right, that anything that emerges in the future will come from that place, from just allyship and solidarity, and see where we take it.
Hey, well, Isabel, it has been fantastic having the chance to speak to you and to build a connection. And I'm already thinking of people who I want to share this interview with from the Community Action Resilience work stream. I think they'll find it really interesting. So I want to say a big thank you for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's really an honor to talk to you and to talk about this work.
Fantastic. Well, I'm just going to press the